Every sunrise is a gift we often overlook. Yet today carries a power yesterday can't reclaim and tomorrow can't promise. In the quiet moments before the world awakens, heaven leans close, whispering that this day is sacred, filled with choices that shape our destiny. This is a morning when faith is tested, storms are faced, and hidden strength is unlocked. Each chapter reveals how God meets us exactly where we stand, in fear, in hope, in brokenness, and in renewal. Today is not ordinary. Today is divine territory. And if you dare to step into it with courage, your entire life can shift in a single prayer. The first rays of morning light pierce through the heavy darkness, casting streaks of gold across the silent room. For many, it was just another dawn. But for our protagonist, this light was a reminder. Each sunrise carries a rare chance to begin anew. The fleeting nature of life pressed in, whispering that yesterday's failures, regrets, and unspoken words were gone forever, and only today remained. As the city stirred awake outside, thoughts tumbled like restless waves within. Did I waste another day? How many dreams remain unfinished? How many apologies never spoken? The internal dialogue was sharp, almost painful, as the weight of unclaimed ambitions and unresolved conflicts surfaced with urgent clarity. It was as if the soul itself was rattling the mind awake. Suddenly, a metaphorical alarm bell tolled, not of metal, but of spirit. It vibrated through every fiber, a call to perspective. Grudges, anxieties, and petty ambitions were insignificant against the expanse of life that lay ahead. The realization struck with both gravity and liberation. Holding on to yesterday only steals the present. Today was all that truly mattered. The protagonist reached instinctively for a quiet moment of prayer, kneeling before the day's first light. Morning prayer became more than ritual. It was surrender, a heartfelt plea for clarity, courage, and gratitude. Simple words formed a lifeline to hope, a conscious decision to let go of fear and embrace the opportunities of the day ahead. Details that could have been mundane. Steam curling from a cup of coffee, birdsong outside the window, the subtle warmth of sunlight on the skin, suddenly pulsed with meaning. Each small moment was a reminder that life is intimate, fragile, and beautiful. In these moments, the battlefield of choices became evident. Every decision mattered, no matter how minor, and every action rippled into eternity. As the morning deepened, the call to live intentionally grew louder. The day stretched ahead, brimming with possibilities that demanded courage and presence. Time was fleeting, and hesitation would be a thief. With a heart awakened, the protagonist faced the dawn with determination, poised on the edge of action, ready to seize the gift that is today, before it slips irretrievably away. In the hours that followed the powerful morning awakening, a subtle heaviness began to settle over the protagonist. Though the sunlight still glowed warmly through the window, shadows from yesterday lingered in the corners of the mind. It became clear that the light of a new day does not erase unfinished memories. It illuminates them. And with that illumination came a wave of emotions too strong to ignore. Regret surfaced first, sharp and uninvited. Faces from the past, conversations left hanging, and dreams once held tightly now felt like ghosts tapping at the door. The protagonist felt the weight of missed opportunities. Moments when fear had won, moments when courage never arrived. Each memory echoed with the same silent accusation. You could have done more. This emotional flood turned the inner world into a battlefield. As coffee cooled on the table, the protagonist stared blankly, wrestling against the bitterness of yesterday's wounds. The pain felt almost physical, as if the chest tightened with every recalled failure. It was here that the tension with Chapter 1 became clear. Even though today offered a new chance, yesterday still demanded acknowledgement. The internal dialogue simmered with intensity. Why didn't I speak up? Why did I let that relationship fall apart? Why did I run from my calling? These questions burned like embers. But buried within them was something unexpected, an emerging desire for redemption. Perhaps yesterday's scars were not meant to punish, but to teach. In an attempt to release the burden, the protagonist reached for an old journal tucked inside a drawer. Pages yellowed by time revealed confessions, hopes, and fears written years ago. Reading them felt like reopening a wound. Yet, something powerful stirred within, the realization that the person they once were did not have to define who they could become today. The emotional tension climaxed when the protagonist pulled out a folded letter, never sent, never read by the person it was meant for. The handwriting trembled slightly, evidence of a younger, more fearful self. Without hesitation, the protagonist tore the letter in half, letting the pieces fall like ashes. It was a symbolic act, a declaration that the past would no longer hold the day hostage. With this release came a shift. Morning prayer, once whispered softly, now deepened into a plea for strength to break free from yesterday's grip. Words flowed with vulnerability, asking for courage, asking for healing, asking for the wisdom to let go. It was no longer a ritual. It was a spiritual cry from a heart desperate for renewal. Through the window, the morning progressed into late morning, birds soaring freely overhead. The protagonist watched them with a pang of longing. How easily they moved through the sky, unburdened by yesterday. It became clear that freedom was possible, but it required decision, a conscious choice to stop looking backward. Hope began to rise with unexpected clarity. If yesterday was a heavy chain, then today could be the key. The protagonist finally understood that living fully in the present requires forgiveness. Forgiveness for self, forgiveness for others, and forgiveness for the life that didn't go as planned. The news of the heart's transformation felt like a quiet victory. In the aftermath of releasing yesterday's emotional weight, the protagonist felt a fragile sense of freedom. Yet it was freedom that trembled, not celebrated. Life, as if testing this newfound clarity, wasted no time presenting the first challenge of the day. The phone buzzed with a message that tightened the chest instantly, a reminder of a problem long ignored. The timing felt almost deliberate, as though today itself wanted to see whether the past would still dictate the present. The protagonist hesitated, staring at the glowing screen. Old fears rose like shadows. The fear of confrontation, the fear of failure, the fear of disappointing others. It became clear that letting go of yesterday emotionally was only the beginning. Facing today with courage was the real battlefield. Every instinct whispered to postpone the issue, to delay, to push it to tomorrow. But hadn't yesterday already stolen enough? Stepping away from the window where sunlight had felt comforting moments ago, the protagonist felt the room darken. Doubt crept in quietly, tightening its grip. What if I'm not ready? What if I make it worse? The inner dialogue turned fierce, almost combative. But amid the chaos, a sliver of truth emerged. Avoiding today would only rebuild the chains torn apart earlier that morning. As tension rose, the protagonist closed their eyes, returning instinctively to prayer. It was no longer a gentle whisper, but a desperate plea for clarity. Give me courage. Give me direction. Hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of choosing a different path. One where today's challenges were faced, not feared. It was a moment of deep vulnerability, but also one of rising resolve. Outside, the weather mirrored the internal storm. Clouds gathered quickly, swallowing the sun and darkening the sky. The wind picked up, rattling the windows with urgency. It was as though the world itself echoed the protagonist's struggle, reminding them that storms come naturally, but so does the strength to stand through them. Nature's drama heightened the moment, turning the day into a symbolic theater of courage. The protagonist finally responded to the message, each tap on the screen feeling like a step onto shaky ground. It wasn't a perfect response, voice steady but not bold, honest but still nervous. Yet it was action, and in that action, a small victory formed. For the first time in a long time, fear did not win immediately. It was a decision that signaled to the heart. Courage grows in motion, not in waiting. But the day wasn't finished testing them. A sudden work crisis emerged, forcing the protagonist into a situation demanding leadership and quick decisions. The pressure was suffocating. Colleagues began messaging frantically, tension rising in real time. The protagonist felt the old panic clawing its way back, threatening to undo all progress made that morning. It was a perfect storm, internal and external forces colliding at once. Yet somewhere deep within, the prayer from earlier echoed like a guiding voice. Instead of freezing, the protagonist took a breath, grounding themselves in the truth that today was the moment to choose bravery. Words came more confidently, instructions clearer, and decisions firmer. Each action chipped away at the fear that once ruled them. It wasn't easy, but it was intentional. As the crisis slowly came under control, a fragile but powerful realization formed. This is what living today truly means. Showing up, even when shaking. Acting, even when afraid. Choosing faith over fear in the smallest of moments. The protagonist began to understand that the greatest battles aren't fought in grand gestures, but in the quiet decisions that shape the momentum of a day. As the afternoon light steadied into a soft glow, the protagonist stood at a quiet crossroads within. The earlier crisis had been managed, and the internal storm had calmed, but new tension brewed beneath the surface. One that felt bigger, heavier, and far more defining. It wasn't just about responding to the day anymore. It was about stepping into something daunting, something long postponed, something that required a leap rather than a step. And this time, hesitation would carry a cost. The message that arrived next was not a crisis, but an opportunity, one that had been offered before and quietly refused each time. A meeting, a proposal, a conversation that could shift the trajectory of the protagonist's life. Fear had rejected it in the past. But today was different. Today, the protagonist felt the weight of the promise made that morning. Live fully. Act courageously. Do not waste a day. The challenge of Chapter 3 had been a warm-up. This was a real test. As the phone buzzed with reminders, the protagonist felt a familiar tightening in the chest. Old doubts crawled back, whispering warnings of embarrassment, rejection, and failure. What if I'm not good enough? What if this ends badly? The internal dialogue sharpened like blades. But something deeper began to speak. A quieter voice, steady and resolute, reminding them the battle's already won today. If courage could appear earlier, why not now? The protagonist paced the room, tore between action and retreat. The setting sun cast long shadows on the walls, turning the entire scene into a dramatic portrait of indecision. The room felt charged, almost sacred, as though the day itself was holding its breath for the next choice. This was not just another moment. It was the moment, the one that separates living from merely surviving. In desperation, the protagonist sank once more into prayer. But unlike the previous ones, this prayer trembled with intensity. It wasn't just a request for guidance. It was a plea for transformation. If I step forward, walk with me. If I fall, help me rise. If I fear, give me strength. Tears threatened but did not fall. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a moment where vulnerability became power. With prayer still hanging in the air, a surprising calm washed over the protagonist. The storm of indecision softened. The fears that once roared now whispered faintly in the background. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps clarity, or perhaps simply the understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. The protagonist stood taller, shoulders squared, breath steady. Then came the decision, quiet yet monumental. The protagonist clicked accept, agreeing to attend a meeting that could alter everything. A single tap on the screen felt like stepping onto a fragile bridge suspended over uncertainty. But it was done, and in that instant, a quiet exhilaration surged, the kind that only arrives when one dares to choose courage over comfort. The world outside seemed to respond. The sun burst through the remaining clouds, casting a dramatic amber light across the landscape. Trees swayed as if applauding, and the air itself felt lighter. The protagonist watched the scene unfold with a stunned sense of gratitude. Nature didn't celebrate small decisions, but this one wasn't small. It was a leap of faith into the unknown. As preparations began, choosing clothes, gathering notes, rehearsing possibilities, the protagonist felt an unfamiliar mix of fear and excitement. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, the excitement was stronger. Every detail felt symbolic. The adjustment of shirt collar, the tightening of shoelaces, the way the door clicked shut behind them. Each action declared, "Today, I am choosing forward." The moment the protagonist stepped outside, wind swept fiercely through the street, as if the world itself sensed the weight of what was unfolding. The sky, once glowing with encouraging sunlight, had turned heavy and ominous. Clouds gathered in thick layers, mirroring the inner turmoil that waited to erupt. It was as though nature issued a warning. Every leap of faith is followed by a storm that tested strength. As the protagonist walked toward the meeting location, each step grew heavier. The earlier calm began to waver. Doubts surged back like a sudden wave, cold and relentless. What if I fail? What if I'm not ready? What if this leap was a mistake? The questions pounded with the rhythm of a rising wind. The closer protagonist came to the destination, the more suffocating the expectations felt, both from others and from within. Near the entrance of the building, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a thunderous crack that shook the air. The storm had arrived suddenly and violently. Rain began to fall in sharp sheets, soaking through clothing and skin as if trying to wash away the courage that had carried the protagonist this far. People rushed for shelter, but the protagonist remained rooted, battling the internal tempest that raged just as fiercely. Inside the lobby, the tension did not ease. A new crisis had erupted, unexpected, complicated, and deeply personal. A message buzzed through the phone, delivering news that tightened the chest instantly. A conflict involving someone protagonists cared about. It couldn't have come at a worse moment. The emotional blow was almost paralyzing, threatening to pull the protagonist away from the opportunity waiting upstairs. The inner conflict spiraled. For a moment, the protagonist's resolve cracked. Should I cancel? Should I run back? Am I being selfish to stay? The internal dialogue was agonizing. The storm outside felt tame compared to the tempest inside the heart. Tears welled at the edges of the protagonist's eyes, but they refused to fall. Turning back would undo everything, yet pressing forward felt impossible. In this moment of collapse, prayer rose again, not gentle, not calm, but raw. The protagonist pressed a trembling hand against her chest and whispered words only they and God could hear. Strength. Please. I can't do this alone. It was not a prayer of elegance. It was a desperate plea from someone standing inches from breaking. And somehow, in that fragility, a thread of strength emerged, a small but steady anchor. As the protagonists wiped their face and stepped into the elevator, time seemed to slow. Each floor chime felt like a heartbeat echoing through a storm. The world beyond the elevator doors was full of uncertainty, but something within was changing. The protagonist wasn't fearless, but they were determined. Courage, even in trembling form, was still courage. When the elevator doors opened, the storm intensified. A hallway of unfamiliar faces, tense energy, and high expectations stretched ahead. The protagonist felt a sudden wave of intimidation hit hard. Every insecurity rose violently. But instead of collapsing, the protagonists straightened their posture, inhaled deeply, and stepped forward. The storm no longer pushed them back. It pushed them onward. The meeting room door stood only a few feet away, glowing faintly beneath flickering lights shaken by the storm. Every step toward it felt like walking against hurricane winds, both literal and emotional. But the protagonist kept moving, fueled by the memory of that morning prayer, the promise to live intentionally, and the truth that today, no matter how stormy, was still a gift. Just as the protagonist reached for the door handle, thunder roared outside, shaking the building. The moment the protagonist crossed the threshold of the meeting room, the world seemed to pause. Conversations quieted, eyes turned, and the storm outside hammered violently against the windows as if demanding entrance. The sudden silence inside created a surreal contrast, a calm center surrounded by chaos. It was here, in this fragile stillness, that something profound began to stir. The faces around the table carried a weight of expectation, yet something in their expressions felt different from what the protagonist had feared. Instead of judgment, there was curiosity. Instead of dismissal, there was space. The protagonist straightened slightly, sensing a shift. Perhaps the storm outside had swallowed the last of their insecurities, leaving only raw honesty behind. Before the protagonist could speak, the leader of the meeting gestured warmly. "We've been waiting for you," he said, not with impatience, but with surprising encouragement. The words struck deep. For so long, the protagonists believed they were always behind, always too late, always unworthy. But these simple words cracked something open. For the first time in years, the possibility of belonging entered the room. As the meeting began, the protagonist spoke, haltingly at first, voice trembling from both fear and lingering emotion. But as the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. Confidence rose not in a sudden burst, but in gentle waves. Words aligned with purpose, Thoughts flowed clearly, and the protagonist's perspective illuminated the conversation in ways even they didn't expect. The room shifted. People listened, truly listened. Thunder boomed outside as though punctuating each breakthrough moment. Every time lightning flashed, it cast dramatic shadows across the protagonist's face, emphasizing the internal transformation already underway. The storm no longer felt threatening. It felt symbolic, almost orchestrated, as if nature itself declared that revelation only blooms through pressure. Each word spoken became an act of bravery. Then came the turning point. One of the senior members leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said the words that froze the room. "We need someone with your insight to lead this next phase." The offer hit like a shockwave. It was beyond anything protagonists expected. Far greater, far heavier, and undeniably life-changing. The protagonist felt a sudden rush of heat, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude collide at once. Memories from earlier that morning resurfaced, regrets, doubts, fears, the whispered prayer for courage, the promise to live fully. This moment felt like the answer to all of it, not a random opportunity, but a divine intersection. The protagonist sensed it clearly. This wasn't an accident. This revelation had been building through every struggle, every storm, every quiet moment of prayer. But revelation often brings conflict. As the room waited for an answer, the protagonist felt a familiar tremor of fear return. Am I capable of this? What if I fail? What if this is too big? The internal war ignited again, but this time, something stronger fought back. The memory of surviving the storm, the realization that courage had already carried them this far, and the truth that today was meant for bold decisions. Taking a slow, steady breath, the protagonists lifted their gaze. Their voice, though soft, carried the weight of conviction. I'll do it. The decision felt like stepping onto sacred ground. The room erupted in nods, smiles, and affirmation. Outside, the storm began to ease for the first time since the journey began. Lightning softened into distant flickers, and rain slowed to a gentle rhythm. It was as though the world exhaled with relief. As the meeting ended and the protagonist stepped back into the hallway, a warmth settled over them, deep, peaceful, and steady. What had begun with fear and self-doubt had ended with revelation, clarity, and purpose. The storm had not broken them. It had revealed them. And though more challenges awaited, one truth was undeniable. Today had become the turning point of a lifetime. Dawn broke with an unusual stillness, as if heaven itself paused to watch what Samuel would choose on this final morning of his long internal battle. He woke before the alarm, heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with an unfamiliar sense of readiness. The echoes of yesterday's revelation still pulsed through him. The realization that God had never asked him to carry tomorrow's burden or yesterday's chains. Only today mattered. Only this breath, this step, this surrender. As Samuel stepped out of his room, he could still feel the sting of the confrontation from the previous chapter, the moment he faced his deepest wounds and the voices that told him he wasn't enough. But instead of letting those memories weaken him, he felt them push him forward, urging him to step fully into the truth God had whispered all along. Yesterday may have tried to break him, but today offered something far more powerful: choice. The house, once filled with a heaviness of regret, now seemed lighter. Sunlight touched the walls as if an unseen hand had drawn back the curtains of his spirit. Samuel paused at the doorway, feeling the shift within him, a sacred stirring that told him God was near. This is the day, he whispered, the day I stop looking back. He walked outside, bare feet touching the cold ground, grounding him in the present moment. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth after a night of quiet rain. It felt symbolic, like God had washed the world clean while Samuel slept, preparing a fresh canvas for him to walk on. For the first time in months, he didn't feel chased by old failures. He felt pursued only by grace. As he reached the small garden where he used to pray, but hadn't dared visit in weeks, a surge of emotion rose in his chest. This place had once been his refuge, but fear had kept him away. Now he stood before it again, trembling not with anxiety but with awe. It was as if God had been waiting for him here all along, waiting for him to return, not as a broken man, but as one willing to rise. Samuel sank to his knees, tears spilling silently. But these tears were different. They didn't carry the bitterness of regret or the sting of shame. They carried relief, release, resurrection. Lord, he whispered through shaking breath, I choose today, not what I lost, not what I fear, not what I failed. I choose what you've given me right now. A sudden warmth enveloped him, a peace that didn't explain itself, didn't argue, didn't demand anything. It simply held him. The same God who walked him through the storm of chapters 5, 6, and 7 now wrapped him with comfort that soothed every trembling corner of his soul. The fear that once ruled him dissolved like mist in sunlight. Rising to his feet, he felt lighter, as if every step lifted him into a new version of himself. He knew challenges would still come. He knew some wounds would still take time to heal. But none of that frightened him anymore. Today wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about walking hand in hand with God, trusting that each sunrise carried new strength. As he looked out across the yard, watching the golden line of morning stretch across the horizon, Samuel finally understood the message God had been crafting through every chapter of his journey. Yesterday is a testimony. Tomorrow is a mystery. But today is holy ground. He breathed deeply, claiming the moment as his own, and with a quiet, steady voice, he declared into morning air, all I truly have is today. In a striking continuation of yesterday's emotional turning point, Samuel woke with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted, not just within him, but around him. Observers close to him described a visible change, noting that the weight he once carried seemed to have vanished overnight. The man who had wrestled with fear for months now stepped into mourning with a boldness that surprised even himself. Reports indicate that the previous day's declaration, all I truly have is today, had become more than a whisper of hope. It had become a breaking headline in Samuel's spirit. Those familiar with his journey confirmed that this shift was not emotional impulse, but a genuine spiritual awakening. Something had finally settled. He was no longer a prisoner of the past. As dawn spread across the sky, Samuel moved through his home with renewed clarity. The spaces that once reminded him of failure now felt like stages for new beginnings. It was as if the atmosphere changed, a close friend later shared. You could feel peace walking behind him. Analysts observing his transformation say this calm is common when individuals finally surrender their regrets. Stepping outside, Samuel felt the wind brush against his face, a simple gesture in nature that now felt like divine confirmation. The same garden where he had knelt in chapter 8 seemed to welcome him back with unusual brightness. Witnesses nearby reported that Samuel stood still for several minutes, as if listening for instructions only heaven could give. The news of his shift did not stop there. Internally, Samuel experienced what he described as a quiet explosion. The silence inside him, once filled with doubt, now pulsed with confidence. Spiritual experts suggest moments like these occur when a person chooses to stop negotiating with fear and starts obeying purpose. In a dramatic and symbolic move, Samuel began cleaning out the old papers, letters, and reminders of failure he had kept hidden. Artifact of a man who no longer existed. It felt like a private press conference, he later said. I was announcing to myself that I am no longer who I was yesterday. Each item thrown away marked a breaking headline of transformation. The morning progressed with intensity as Samuel found himself journaling dreams he had buried long ago. Reports show that his writing carried urgency, as though he feared missing the very window of opportunity God had opened for him. Psychologists often note that clarity follows surrender, and Samuel's renewed vision supported that idea. The spiritual momentum continued to build. Those watching his journey believed God was orchestrating something beyond personal renewal, something that would soon influence the people connected to Samuel's life. His choice to live fully in the present had not only altered his internal world, but was beginning to shift the atmosphere around him. At approximately mid-morning, Samuel paused again, overwhelmed by gratitude. He later described a moment as a holy interruption, where he felt God whisper, "This is why I told you to wake up." The message struck him with force. Today wasn't just another sunrise. This was the answer to a long-buried prayer. And so, with the day unfolding before him like a divine assignment, Samuel stepped forward, not cautiously, but courageously. Witnesses say his face carried the look of someone who had finally caught up to the purpose God wrote for him. The man who once feared tomorrow now walked with confidence, knowing heaven moves whenever a person decides to fully live the only moment they truly own, today. Following yesterday's unexpected surge of spiritual clarity, Samuel entered the new morning with momentum that witnesses described as almost electric. The man once defined by hesitation now walked with purpose, so sharp it seemed to cut to the remnants of his old fears. Sources close to him say that today did not feel like a continuation. It felt like a confrontation. Early reports reveal that Samuel sensed a different kind of pressure as the day began. Unlike the fear that used to cripple him, this pressure felt external, almost as if the darkness he once surrendered to realize it was losing its grip. Analysts of spiritual behavior interpret this phenomenon as the final resistance before a breakthrough, a last attempt from the past to reclaim its influence. As Samuel moved through the kitchen, the same space that once echoed with doubt, he felt a subtle tension rising. The air felt heavier. Conversations in his mind grew louder, and old failures resurfaced with surprising force. But instead of shrinking back, he stood still, gripping the edge of the counter, as though anchoring himself to the truth he claimed in previous chapters. Observers suggest this was the moment the real battle began. Memories that once controlled him returned like headlines from a darker time, attempting to rewrite his morning. But Samuel refused to let yesterday's news shape today's narrative. With a steadiness not seen before, he whispered, "Not today, not anymore." His voice shook, but it did not break. In a dramatic turn, Samuel stepped outside, hoping the open air would clear his mind. Instead, he found himself overwhelmed by the sense that something unseen was pushing back against his newfound confidence. For a moment, he felt small again, like the old Samuel trapped in the old cycle. But then he remembered the promise that carried him through chapter 9. Heaven moves when you choose today. Breaking reports confirm that Samuel lifted his face to the sky, eyes burning with determination. "If this is a fight," he said quietly, "then I'm not fighting alone." The words were simple, but witnesses say they carry the authority of someone finally aware of who walked beside him. It was a declaration, not to himself, but to the spiritual forces that once dictated his steps. And then something shifted. The heaviness in the air thinned. The pressure eased, and Samuel felt a warmth settle over him like a shield. Experts describe this as the moment spiritual alignment takes place. The moment a surrendered heart becomes a battleground heaven refuses to lose. Samuel's choice to stand firm had drawn divine reinforcement. Energized by this sudden lift, Samuel walked through his yard with new intensity. He prayed aloud, not timidly, but boldly, as if speaking on behalf of every past version of himself still trapped in fear. His words weren't rehearsed. They spilled out raw, urgent, alive. Witnesses say even the atmosphere seemed to respond, growing calmer with each declaration. By late morning, reports indicate that Samuel felt a peace so profound it bordered on supernatural, a peace that didn't just comfort him but claimed victory over the storm inside him. He described it later as the moment I realized the war was never between me and my past. It was between fear and purpose purpose finally won. And as Samuel stepped back inside his home, the tension that once haunted his mornings was nowhere to be found. He didn't just survive another day. He reclaimed it. This was a turning point. The moment the man who once lived in the shadow of yesterday stepped completely into the power of today. And for the first time, the battle didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a victory. Less than 24 hours after Samuel's decisive spiritual victory, new developments emerged that startled even those closely observing his transformation. What began as a quiet morning soon escalated into a series of events that experts are calling the aftershock of breakthrough, a phenomenon where internal change begins to manifest externally in unexpected ways. Sources confirm that Samuel woke with an unusual sense of alertness. Unlike the previous chapter's heavy spiritual confrontation, today felt strangely calm, as if the battlefield had been cleared, leaving behind a silence filled with hidden possibility. Witnesses say Samuel walked through his home with the cautious expectation of someone waiting for something he couldn't yet name. As he stepped onto his porch, Samuel noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in his surroundings. The wind, the trees, even the distant hum of the neighborhood carried a gentler tone. Those close to him later described the atmosphere as almost sacred, the kind of calm that arrives only after heaven intervenes. But the most dramatic development came when Samuel received an unexpected message from someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a person tied directly to the wounds that once fueled his darkest fears. Analysts say this moment was not coincidence, but a direct consequence of Samuel's internal breakthrough. When a person breaks free, one spiritual expert noted, life responds. The message was simple, a request for reconciliation, yet its impact on Samuel was immediate and overwhelming. Reports indicate he stood frozen for several minutes, heart pounding, unsure whether the sudden development was a blessing, a test, or both. This was the past he thought he had buried, the past that once dictated his every choice. Instead of collapsing into old fear, Samuel took a deep breath, reminding himself of the truth he declared in chapter 10. This was not the same man who hid from his history. This was a man who had stood his ground, resisted the storm, and chosen today. If this is happening now, he murmured, then God must think I'm ready. As Samuel considered how to respond, witnesses say a profound calm enveloped him, a gentle reminder that he was no longer fighting alone. The same divine reinforcement that strengthened him in the previous chapter now settled around him like a quiet assurance. This wasn't a setback. It was a sign of healing beginning its work. With a trembling but determined hand, Samuel typed a short reply, one rooted not in fear but in freedom. Those who later read the message described it as unexpectedly gracious, the kind of response only possible when a person has truly let go of yesterday's chains. It marked a turning point not just in the situation, but in Samuel himself. What followed was even more remarkable. Almost immediately after sending the message, Samuel felt a wave of peace so deep it brought him to tears. Observers believe this moment was the beginning of a larger miracle, a restoration that had been waiting for years, now finally set in motion because he chose courage over fear, presence over regret, today over yesterday. As the chapter closed, Samuel stood in the doorway of his home, no longer a man haunted by the past, but one stepping into a future shaped by divine intervention. And though he didn't know what awaited him next, one thing had become unmistakably clear. When a heart finally embraces today, heaven wastes no time sending miracles toward it. In a powerful continuation of yesterday's breakthrough, new developments unfolded around Samuel that witnesses described as nothing short of astonishing. What began as a quiet morning in chapter 11 quickly evolved into a day marked by emotional reckoning, unexpected reunions, and the unmistakable evidence that heaven was not finished writing his story. Reports indicate that Samuel didn't sleep well, not from anxiety, but from the overwhelming anticipation stirred by the message he received from his long-estranged acquaintance. What had been unresolved for years was suddenly knocking on the door of his life again. Yet, unlike the man he once was, Samuel didn't approach the situation with fear. He approached it with faith. As the sun climbed higher, another unexpected message arrived, this time from a family member he had also drifted away from during his darkest seasons. Analysts observing Samuel's transformation believe the second message confirms a larger spiritual pattern. When one part of a wounded past begins to heal, the rest follows like a row of dominoes falling under divine timing. Witnesses close to Samuel say he stared at the message for a long time, caught between disbelief and gratitude. The man who once avoided any form of emotional confrontation now found himself at the center of a restoration he didn't initiate. It felt like God was orchestrating a reunion tour, one observer noted. Except Samuel didn't plan it. He just became willing. Tension rose dramatically when Samuel realized that the person reaching out wanted to meet in person. This request reopened buried nerves, echoing fears that had once paralyzed him. But instead of retreating into the shadows of his old patterns, Samuel took a deep breath and whispered, "I will not run for what God is redeeming." Later that afternoon, in what is now being called a watershed moment in Samuel's journey, he met with the first person who reached out. Witnesses at the scene described the emotional atmosphere as thick, raw, and charged with years of unspoken pain. The two stood across from each other, silent at first, until Samuel broke the tension with a simple, trembling, "Thank you for coming." Observers say the conversation that followed was not polished or perfect. It was honest, messy, and drenched in vulnerability. Years of misunderstanding were peeled back layer by layer as both sides admitted to wounds, regrets, and silent battles. What shocked onlookers most was Samuel's composure. Instead of being overwhelmed, He remained anchored, strengthened by the spiritual awakening that began in earlier chapters. A dramatic turning point came when both individuals, once divided by hurt, agreed to forgive one another. It was like watching chains fall off in real time, one witness reported. The reconciliation did not erase the past, but it redeemed it. Analysts say this kind of healing is rare, often happening only when someone reaches a level of internal freedom strong enough to ripple outward. When Samuel returned home that evening, he collapsed onto his couch, not from exhaustion, but from awe. The miracles of the last 2 days had unfolded so swiftly, so unexpectedly, that he could hardly take them in. He no longer felt like a man patching old wounds. He felt like someone receiving new life. As the day closed, Samuel realized that this restoration was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of a season he thought he would never experience. And though he sensed that more challenges and breakthroughs were still ahead, one truth remained clear. When a person finally chooses to live fully in today, heaven begins repairing everything yesterday tried to destroy.